Hello, I'm Angela Paiva, Chair of the AES New York section, and on behalf of the officers and other committee members, I'd like to welcome you to our special event today, the Eventide Historical Panel, 50 Years of Audio Innovation with Richard Factor and Anthony Agnello, moderated by Eliot Kissileff. Let me start by introducing our moderator, Eliot Kissileff, who is an engineer, filmmaker, historian, and researcher with a focus on the 60s and early 70s music scene. He began his audio career in 1996 with 12 years as a tech at Electric Lady and Sony Music Studios. In 2007, he started with Universal Music Group as a tech and engineer. He worked on numerous reissue projects by artists such as the Allman Brothers, Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, along with extensive work preserving the Motown catalog. He has done stem mixing and file verification for various areas of the UMG supply chain. In 2014, he began working with Academy Award-winning director Murray Lerner on archiving and preservation of his film from the Newport Folk Festival, 1963 to 66, as well as the Isle of Wight in 1970. Richard Factor, who was one of the founders of Eventide Clockworks in 1971 and remains active as chairman on Eventide's 50th anniversary in 2021. At Eventide, he designed and developed some of the first digital products used in recording, including the 1745 series of delay lines, initially using shift registers, followed by the then-new semiconductor memory chips. Tony Agnello joined Eventide in 1973, and in 1975 designed the first pro audio digital effects device, the H910 harmonizer. In 1979, Mr. Agnello led the development of the industry's first general-purpose digital signal processor, the SP2016, introducing the concept of plug-in effects. Mr. Agnello developed algorithms that realistically simulated natural reverberation, as well as several innovative effects. Additionally, quoting a recent press release, the AES Society's highest technical award, the AES Gold Medal Award, is given in recognition of outstanding achievements sustained over a period of years in the field of audio engineering. Gold Medal Awards were presented to Richard Factor and Tony Agnello for making the world sound better and often weirder through the continuous development of signal processors that inspire users and delight listeners. Factor and Agnello were recognized for their substantial and ongoing individual contributions to the advancement and application of audio science. Together, Factor and Eventide Audio co-founder and chairman, and Agnello managing director, continue to lead Eventide as their company celebrates its 50th anniversary of audio innovation. Welcome to our audience and our panelists.
Hello, Richard and Tony. Thank you for doing this.
Hello, Elliot. Thank you for
Hey.
doing this. Whatever this turns
I
out
hope
to
you
be.
feel that way when we're done.
Yeah. Well, it's a real pleasure and honor, you know, and in the past couple days of sort of going over all of this, even though I've been in the studio business for, 25 years, to realize, to really put myself back in the early days and think about what the world was like before Eventide, it's, and then the innovation through it, it's pretty awe-inspiring. So I'm wondering one thing. Were you guys music fans prior to starting Eventide, and what were some of your favorites, and did that influence, your beginnings of getting into this and the creation?
Richard?
Del Shannon's Runaway? I don't know. I've been a rock and roll fan ever since I can remember. I'm a tiny bit older than Tony, but
Just a tiny bit.
Just a tiny bit, but yeah, I started listening to rock and roll. I worked in radio, WABC, for a number of years, and to this very day, I listen to psychedelic music on a streaming station. And as Tony will agree, we're both bits of fossils as far as our musical taste is concerned.
So when Richard mentioned Del Shannon, I thought of Dion and the Belmonts and Runaround Sue.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Don't ask us to sing. The tragedy is we probably would.
We would, yes. No, and I was in high school when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. Changed my life like so many others.
So how exactly did, because it changed most people's lives by, they went and started garage bands and picking up guitars and basses, but you guys sort of took a different track. How did that, I mean, was it like the post-Revolver Beatles? Did that sort of?
Well, my high school was Brooklyn Tech, so I've always had a love and affinity for math and science. So I was on path to I thought physics maybe. In fact, when I first went to college, I was in a physics program. But at the same time, I was playing music, and I'm the first son of a Italian American family. My father was an immigrant, and the house was always filled with music. My mom played guitar and accordion. My dad played mandolin. And there was always music around our house. So played music from a very young age. Just never very good at it.
So and then I guess back to Richard. Did the psychedelic music sort of inspire you to be part of the music industry? Or, I mean, I know you were in the radio end, but like, what sort of, was this part of the big inspiration to begin creating these products?
I want to give a little credit to Bob Moog, because his article in the 65 AES journal about how you could build a synthesizer, and he built theremins, and I said, boy, this is fun. And I never let my classwork interfere with my education. My degree actually is in economics, but what I really liked doing was building stuff. And I built a delay line that was all of 1 or 2 milliseconds, because those were the parts that were available. And I never had any inspiration to actually play music or make music, but I built a synthesizer, and I guess that's a psychedelic. And between that and a theremin, I mean, how much more psychedelic can you get?
What year was that?
The theremin would have been 60, maybe 63, 64. I actually visited Bob Moog in Trumansburg. I was going to school in Ithaca, and he was just a short ride from there, and got to see the original Moog behind a curtain in his Trumansburg lab.
So was that a big sort of inspirational moment, I guess?
I think in retrospect, it may very well have been. I didn't realize it was an inspiration at the time, because I was very involved in ham radio. Once again, you get rather psychedelic sounds off the shortwave radio. But between broadcasting and ham radio, and not being much of a student in high school, I kept myself busy.
Mm. So was there any sort of mission or thought process that you had when you first started the company?
Survival?
Well, there must have been a thought process. I mean, how could there not be? Who knows what it might have been? Right. The story I always tell is I was working in a defense plant. I turned 26, so I wasn't subject to the draft. My friend and other co-founder of Eventide, Steve Katz, said, "Hey, I need something for the studio. I want a tape search unit." And at that point, I said, "Well, gee, I could put that together. I need the capstan thing from Ampex, but other than that, I could do the digital circuitry." And it just moved on from there, because I was involved with the studio, I was involved in radio, and I like sound and music.
So when you created the DDL as the first product, did you envision all of the applications that it would have, or did you just, did you have a thought of what it would be used for?
No, really. The first DDL that I built, which was pre-Eventide, again using shift registers, in effect, that back in the day, integrated circuits weren't quite as reliable as they are now. You had a 4-section shift register of 256 bits each, and we used them in the products we made, which were spectrum analyzers in my military company. And if one of the sections went bad, you couldn't use it for anything there. So they said, "Oh yeah, go ahead, take it home." Maybe they never said it, but they would have if I had asked. And I built a delay line in my bedroom, and hey, this is neat. You can do all sorts of stuff. It even made pretty patterns on the oscilloscope, which was a surplus Fairchild.
Right. And
I'm not
those
sure I'm
kinds of
answering your question, but those are memories.
that's fine. Those patterns were used in Phil Maurice light shows too. So
No doubt.
they were psychedelic. So what was the transition then of saying, I built this thing in my bedroom, now I'm going to start a company? I mean, did you do it to make money, or were you doing it for the joy of it, or both?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, that was an or? Yes,
yeah, well,
absolutely. No, Steve, well, I was building stuff before that, but when Steve said he needed a tape search unit, I got involved with the studio, and we went to an AES convention and just sort of mocked up some products, including a phaser. And some of these things did something, some of them just had knobs. We built a mock transmitter because I thought it might be nice to let people hear what their music sounded like on the radio, and eventually settled on products and made money on them, which is good. And I always liked what I was doing. I'm a lucky guy. I never had to work.
So I saw one interview where you mentioned that the early analog to digital conversions actually sounded good. So why was that? And then A to D conversions started to sound so terrible later on. Like,
shall I take that one, Tony?
Sure.
Yeah. The converter, again, I learned how to do this at Federal Scientific, the now defunct, but then very active company making spectrum analyzers, invented, at least I assume they invented, what they called the rundown converter. And all it did was charge a capacitor to a certain voltage and discharge it through a constant current sink, and use a comparator to tell when it crossed zero. And the time that it required to cross zero was in effect, the voltage. Well, the beauty of that converter, even though you'd have had to run it at gigahertz, which you couldn't have done at the time, was that it was absolutely and beautifully monotonic. Every increment, even around the zero crossing, was perfect. You didn't get that fuzziness and nasty sound that you get when one bit is bigger than the other bit. So it wasn't that many bits, but it really sounded good.
Interesting. So was that the first analog to digital conversion of audio?
I doubt it.
No. No, the technique that was common was successive approximation at the time, using a DAC. Because DACs are pretty easy to integrate, so DACs were available pretty early on, 8-bit DACs, and you could use a DAC to do conversion. The problem with that is DACs aren't particularly linear, so when you get to very, very small voltages, those bits bounce around, as opposed to this rundown approach where it's totally monotonic.
Mm. So when you first had the prototype of the product and the very first time it got tested in a real environment, were you there, or do you remember any of this? I mean, or did you just give it to someone to test?
Well, I was there because, as Tony said earlier, we had a studio in the building.
We were very lucky.
I remember the first one we made was to be sold to Maryland Public Broadcasting. And I'm sure, not that I remember exactly with what, maybe with McKendree Spring. We were probably recording McKendree Spring in those days. Took it up to the studio and said, here, use this for a while. And there you have it, sure.
Right. I saw that. I was listening through to the record recently, and you don't really hear, it sounds pretty folky and not, I don't hear much psychedelia in it. So if they used it, it didn't really change the the sound of the music all that much. But then soon enough you would have the next product. I mean, did the phaser, was that really soon after the DDL? It was like a year later, or was it already in development?
It was certainly in development. I think it maybe even have been earlier. I'm not entirely certain. We didn't really keep great records then any more than we do now.
We did find a prototype, though, Richard,
Yeah,
of the phaser before you had the idea of using op amps. It was all
yeah,
transistor
I'm
based.
sure. Well, I didn't have that idea. That was Dave Blackmer.
The op amps were Dave Blackmer. But
Yeah.
you actually
well,
built, you built it. You built a phaser with just transistors,
mhm.
and you were smart enough to have controls like for envelope follower, which always blew me away. You were very early on.
Smart or lucky.
I would probably go with smart. So how was the company doing in the first year or two? Was it immediately successful? Were there ever any like touchy moments, or was it sort of just an upward slope the whole time?
Well, I didn't get paid.
Nor did I. Yeah, I think it was about a half a year before I got any money, before I took a salary. We'd spend our money on parts and whatever. But then, and to a large extent now, really, I live on chocolate. And as long as I have a place that's warm enough, I'm fine. And so I spent the first year or two leaning over a light table making printed circuit artwork. That's pretty much where the time went. And as far as the money went, I had enough to pay my rent, which was a lot cheaper in those days. So it depends on how you define success. We were always successful enough to stay in business, which is, I think, quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, and to hold on, and to hold on to the company all this time is also a pretty major accomplishment in 2022.
Something to that.
Well, as Richard said, we've been incredibly fortunate.
So how stable was the gear at that point? I mean, were there a lot of fails, or was it really, were there any like epic fails, or was it pretty easy to, I mean, did you do all the repairs?
Yeah,
well,
nothing.
The repairs started before we shipped, right?
Yeah.
Infant mortality stretching into middle age.
Yeah, remember my comment on the shift registers. The shift registers that we used in the first delay line were, let's just call them seconds. And we found that out because we bought them from an ad in an electronics publication in those days, which was actually printed on paper. You may remember that. And they were very inexpensive, which is how we got into that business. And the reason they were very inexpensive is they were, we found out later, rejects from IBM. And one day they accidentally shipped us a lot that had been intended for IBM, and they worked perfectly. Gee, what's going on here? But we made the best of it. We, as Tony said, infant mortality lasted to middle age, but you build it, 2 or 3 would fail, you wait a week, 1 would fail, you wait another week, maybe we could ship it now.
We used to burn these in at high temperature to get those ICs to fail, and we'd swap them out.
Wow. So how was the next product then, I guess, was the Omnipressor? So it seems like each of these things, as you really like take a look at them, was its own sort of revolution. So the notion of look-ahead compression was, I guess, the next, innovation that you guys, created. How did you come up with these things, with that?
You remember the 18-minute gap? You old enough to remember that?
I live in that world.
Say again?
I live in that world, so yes.
Oh. Well, now it gets larger and smaller, but the famous 18-minute gap, which was investigated by a guy named Mark Weiss. Right. He was part of the President's Commission, and he was a colleague of mine at the military-industrial complex where I worked, and we remained friends. He's a pilot, and used to be a pilot, not anymore, of course. And we would chat from time to time. And at one point, he mentioned a certain concept about he called it a homomorphic filter. And I listened to what he was saying, and maybe I wasn't paying good enough attention. But while I was listening to him, I said, "Wait a minute! If we did this, if we did the side chain with the Omnipressor and made it separate, wouldn't that be interesting? Because then you could control the amplitude apart from the input signal, or do anything you want to with it, because you wouldn't be limited by, well, infinite compression, let's say.
Right.
And that's how that thing got started, and it really sounded great. Still does.
Wow. So did the sidechain exist at that point, or did you create that as well?
I don't believe so. We don't know of any, right?
Yeah,
I mean, compressors and limiters didn't have sidechains.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to take credit for everything, and fortunately, because we both were really young when this started, we most likely outlived most people who could take credit for things. So sure, we invented it all, but I'm not really sure of that, honestly.
Yeah. So we were talking about the omnipressor, and one thing about it that I was sort of wondering about is the DBX technology and the connection, and how that figured into this and any of the other products, because in the modern world, it's, DBX is sort of like a lost trail of Dolby in a way, and obviously there's more to it than that. So I'm curious about what it was for you, for Eventide.
We Sound Exchange, the studio, bought DBX noise reduction. I give Steve Katz the credit and the blame for that. And because we were one of the pioneers in the New York area using DBX, Dave Blackmer himself would occasionally come and visit, and we had some really fruitful discussions with him. And we used their products off the shelf. They made OEM cards. We took their modules and used them, and they entered, or were pretty significant in a lot of our early products, as you pointed out.
So I was wondering also who wrote the product blurbs for the products, because I was reading the Omnipressor one. It said the Omnipressor wants to be your friend, and please read the application section before blaming it for malfeasance and deviltry.
Nikolai Ivanovich Novichevsky wrote them. Okay. Or if you're not a Tom Lehrer fan, it would be who deserves the credit and who deserves the blame. And tragically,
it was Richard. It was Richard.
It is I.
And Richard is still writing, and he's a brilliant writer.
Yeah, and it's great though, because it's sort of you feel the sort of attitude and sense of humor about it that is sort of lost in corporate America. So it's
in those days, as unfortunately or fortunately now, I have no editor. And so whenever I write something, I'm the one who gets to decide whether I can get away with it. And nothing has changed.
So how was that sort of attitude received in the early 70s? I mean, was it I guess it was a pretty cool time, and
there was no internet. You didn't get feedback. You didn't get trolls. You send out something and there it is.
Mm. So then moving on to the next product, I guess the flanger would be the next thing, the FL201. And
was that next? Was that next to the H910? I'm not sure.
I see 74 for both. So on your timeline, I don't know. You guys tell me.
Well, Richard did the flanger and I did the 910, so they probably happened at the same time.
So then, Tony, how did it come about for you? Was there a prototype that Richard was working on prior to this, or did you create this out of whole cloth? Like,
for the 1745M delay line, Richard had built a pitch change module. So, and again, Elliot, these things were dead obvious. I mean, we were replacing things that tape machines did. So it's not like we invented pitch change. We just did it digitally. So Richard had created a module for the 1745M, which stood for memory, not module, but could have. So that was there. And again, I had access to this recording studio in the same building. So when it wasn't booked, I was able to use the gear. I was recording friends. I was playing. And pitch change seemed cool, but my initial idea for the harmonizer was a keyboard instrument. a relative keyboard where middle C would be unison pitch, and you could move up and down the keyboard and create harmonies as you performed. And that was the original prototype.
So I saw a video of you with John Anderson or you with Tony Visconti, talking about the David Bowie track, and it was almost as if you were having a big moment of awareness of the impact that you had on the music. Is that something you guys realized at the time, that you literally changed the face of popular music?
No, I was too busy thinking what to do next. And look, you know, again, our gear ended up replacing a lot of tape machines and tape ops. You know, either a pre-delay for a plate or for double tracking. So our gear was being used pretty much everywhere by everybody, but not in ways that you would particularly notice. I mean, you know, you mentioned McKendree Spring and not really hearing it, but you know, some of those vocals might have been double tracked using a delay line rather than the vocalist singing it twice. So and you know, and then you'd hear unusual. I think you're referring to Ashes to Ashes. I remember talking with Tony, and you know, he brought that up, and you know, he said it was the flanger and with envelope follower, and I could totally hear it now. But when the song came out, it was really cool. Never occurred to me to think, well, maybe he used something that, you know, that Eventide built.
Did you get a lot of feedback from artists and engineers at the time? I mean, were there anyone you were particularly close with, or you were just in the lab building?
Well, as Richard said, there was no internet, so you know, occasionally folks would call us up. But I think mainly the artists that we were aware of, the ones who were brave enough or had the road crew to take our stuff on the road. So you know, that would be Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa, ELP, and those people we knew because they would take them on the road and things would fail and we'd have to fix them.
But did you ever have I mean, I don't know if you had the interaction with the artists at the time, you know, to understand how important what you had created was to their music.
If it wasn't Eventide, it would have been somebody else. Again, we were, you know, Richard said it at the outset, we were fortunate. We were at the right place at the right time. We were young. Richard was a, you know, brilliant hobbyist. I was studying this stuff in university, and we got lucky enough to come together in New York with a recording studio, loving music. And to my mind, we always just did what seemed obvious as the next thing to do. You know, technology comes along and you go, oh, that's great. Now I can do that.
But you are the first ones to do it, so
right place at the right time.
Yeah. So I'm curious about something else. You know, I'm a big fan of Shark Tank, and I was just wondering, you know, what your margins were in those days and what your sales were like, if you're able to talk about that.
I have no clue. Richard, we had margin? I guess we had. Yeah, we would charge whatever the market would bear. You
remember how Woody Allen just happened to have Marshall McLuhan next to him and Annie Hall? I just happened to have Mark Cuban over here. And Mark, Mark, come on. Oh, he's gone shy. Never mind. Everything that we made or didn't make, we can blame on another audio industry pioneer, once again, no longer with us, Ham Brosius. Ham sold us sold Sound Exchange, the recorder, and he was a bit of a guru because we were in our 20s, and Ham was a guru. Ham, what do? We're building stuff. How do we sell it? Well, you give this discount, you sell it for this much, you multiply the cost of your parts by whatever. And we didn't have really employees. We had me, Tony, you know, maybe a technician or two, or whatever. And we didn't have to make a lot of money. Of course, we wanted to, but we followed his advice and said, well, you can multiply the cost of the parts. And it seemed to have worked. And also, the one very useful thing for a new company, we gave a big discount for prompt payment, because we didn't know what kind of a business we were in right away. We found out, but
Right.
people would pay on time because it was a big discount. So commercially, that may be the best piece of advice we ever got.
So, once the 910 came out, was that the moment where you got catapulted into the stratosphere, or was there a moment like that, or was there a product that did that, or did it just sort of steadily build?
Richard, I don't know. I don't. We're not in the stratosphere, are we? I don't think we ever.
Well, we were with the Argus moving map display, but
That's true.
that was only temporary.
But literally,
You know, the H910, well, that was our most successful product in those days, was it not? I think by far.
I think so.
Yeah.
So
So
it's a little bit more affordable than Delay, and it it had a set of features, and it even had an optional keyboard, so you could use it in the way I originally envisioned. And I think a few artists did. Didn't Elton John tour with it one tour where he had it sitting up on the piano?
I'm not sure of that. I do remember that John Anderson fell in love with it.
Mm-hmm.
And used Tony's prototype, making his solo album, Elias Sonhillo. Great album, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Not as great as Fragile, though.
Or the SM, or close to the edge. So I'm trying to think of other people. Were you involved? Did Stevie Wonder have any involvement with this stuff, or Bob and Malcolm? I mean, were they people you knew?
Tonto's Exploding Headband.
Yeah. Did you visit Bob and Malcolm in Venice? Were you there when we went there? They had this most amazing synthesizer room. It was I don't know how much you can see in the background here. I guess you can't see the whole room, but it was this big circular synthesizer with giant 5-volt power buses, or whatever the voltage was, and I guess they must have worked with Stevie Wonder, right? Yeah. And at one AES convention, Stevie Wonder came over and handed me, or maybe Tony, I think it was me, a tiny little diffraction grating about that big. And he said that was our prize, or our award for doing whatever it was we did at the time. I love that. I wish I still had it. I have no idea where it is now. Sadly.
Wow.
Many years and many moves.
So did you, as the live applications, I guess, particularly of the H910 and the DDL, were you going to concerts in the 70s throughout? Did you see your products in action, and how did that feel?
Scary. I kept worrying that they'd fail during the show, so it was terrifying if I knew our gear was actually being used. Fortunately, I didn't normally know that our gear was being used, other than, as I said, Zappa and a few others. I'm sorry, Richard.
No problem. I think Tony is a more skillful warrior than I am. I never worried about this stuff, but I got to go to a lot of concerts, loved everything about it. Sadly, when we moved to New Jersey, we kind of lost that scene. But I was a hanger-outer. Right.
So were you?
Got plenty of stories.
Okay. Any good that you'd like to share at the moment?
Too many.
Okay. So did you guys visit the studios like much in New York when you were bringing, when the gear was being used? Did you demo stuff for people, or was there any any favorite studios that you remember from the 70s?
Well, Record Plant, but I don't remember demoing. I remember dropping stuff off. And Richard, you've dropped stuff off at, I guess, Record Plant Power Station.
I can tell you one cute little story. When we were making the Commodore PET spectrum analyzer, I got this phone call late at night from Studio Instrument Rentals. It turns out Blondie was recording or rehearsing or doing something at SIR, and they had heard about this thing, and they wanted one right then, not because they needed it for anything, but just to show it as background to one of their songs. So you see this Commodore PET with the spectrum bars going up.
Right.
But yeah, we both did a little of that, but not a whole lot. That wasn't really our thing.
Hmm. So did either of you go to the Watkins Glen Festival in 1973?
We both did.
So were you working it, or were you just sort of watching? I mean, whose idea was it to use the DDL and the time alignment and all of that?
Well, it was the Grateful Dead's idea, I think, right, Richard?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the Grateful Dead used our stuff.
Dan Healy in particular, right? Wasn't it Dan?
Dan, and I think that was pre-Don Pearson, so probably it was all Dan.
It was Dan.
But the way that works, since you mentioned Watkins Glen, we both went, as Tony said, but he was actually there during the show, whereas I was doing something or other with Led Zeppelin. But a friend of mine who was a pilot, and I got in an airplane and dropped off, not literally to be sure, a couple of delay lines right before the show, a couple of days earlier. If you saw those aerial photos of Watkins Glen, that's where those came from.
Wow.
And then I drove up and set them up and calibrated them and made sure they worked through the show. In fact, I had the good fortune of being there for the sound check, and Dan Healy was backstage, and there were so many people between the sound booth that was sitting out in the audience and backstage that Dan couldn't get to the sound booth until about 4 or 5 songs in. So Ramrod and I actually mixed the sound check for those first songs. I remember pushing up the bass and Phil Lesch's mic when he started singing backgrounds. So
those were the days.
It was fun.
Those were the days.
That was a very crazy time.
Yeah.
But I had been to Isle of Wight as a college student, so it wasn't my first massive concert.
Oh, in 1970?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'd love to talk to you about that at some point. Obviously pre-Eventide. And the sound at that show, I would imagine from the audience perspective, was not very good. Or was it?
Well, I don't know. You couldn't actually walk around. It was so crowded. So I was at the sound booth and it sounded fine there, but I had the best seats in the house.
Right. Wow. So I guess then one of the next things, when it came to the 949, what were the sort of innovations that went into that? I mean, it seems like obviously the next jump, but did it sort of change anything much?
To my mind, it did. I mean, for one thing, the 910 glitched. And so the H949 had some intelligence. We got lucky again. A charge coupled device came along that was that you could use. It was actually designed for radar that you could use to do autocorrelation and look for good splicing points. And so the 949 did that. It was a deglitched harmonizer. We also knew that folks like Van Halen and others were using the 910 to do double tracking with just a slight amount of pitch change. So we designed in the 949 this micro pitch capability. And we also designed in some randomization to try to make that double tracking seem less digital and more natural. Mm. So and Moore's law. So there was higher density memory, so it had a lot more delay. It had a repeat feature. So yeah. Again, but Eliot, all of these just seem natural next steps. Technology advances and you take advantage of it.
I mean, it's great that you can be so humble about all this, but being you, I guess you would be. But did you realize at the time, like what the 949 became for the studio industry was, the ability to tune vocals and reprint them. That was in place for 20 more years. Throughout all of the other advances, people were still using that 949. It probably into the mid 2000s.
Well, that's good. No, really, I can't. It's hard for me to think back. At the time, it was just, okay, what's next? I was thinking a lot. I spent a lot of time on reverb, just thinking about how to create a good artificial reverb. signal processing writ large, what other things you could do. I was also fortunate when I was in grad school at City University, there was a PDP-11, and as a little project, I built an A to D converter just to try to get audio into it, and I had access to Bell Labs journals, so I was reading, stuff that was being published by Schroeder and folks at the labs. And then after I got my master's, I took a course with Tom Parsons at Brooklyn Polytech and learned about vocoding. So, I was very fortunate to be in New York and, working at Eventide and not playing much music, but playing a little bit, going to shows occasionally, but mainly just thinking about what was next.
So in the development of the reverb, then, was there something different about how you approached it versus? I mean, was there a competition at the time even? I mean, there were some.
Yeah, it was clearly the next step. Again, it was clear that this digital technology had already replaced tape machines, and echo plates. EMT was really the first because they could see the writing on the wall. They could see the plate on the wall, right? They were selling plates that were very expensive, and they had a relationship with Barry Blesser at MIT, and they knew that eventually you could use digital techniques to create a good reverb. And so they attacked that problem first. And the box that they created at EMT 250 was quite a challenge. I mean, this predates having things like multipliers, digital multipliers that were fast enough to do signal processing. So they built this incredible box. What was that, like 78, Richard? It was pretty early on.
I don't remember the date on
it was the first digital reverb, and it sounded pretty good. They used modulation, which I wasn't a fan of because you could hear some swimming going around, but they did that to spread the echo density a bit. And I just happened to look it up because I've been working on these flashbacks, and they were charging $72,000 in today's dollars for that box.
Wow. So how was yours? Different or better?
Well, again, Manfred Schroeder had written a paper very early on in the early 60s, suggesting connecting a number of parallel loops and then following it with some all passes. And I remember at one point hauling up into the studio, I think 7 delay lines and patching it through the Flickinger console to hear what that would sound like, and it was awful. So, it was clear to me that no matter how many parallel combs you had, the echo density, it was going to sound like a comb filter, and the echo density wouldn't build up naturally. And you had to come up with a way to interconnect delays, and that's now called a feedback delay network. But I didn't have a name for it, but
so. It seems like there were also other things that were going on in Eventide during all of this for fun, I guess, and profit. Like, were you sort of making RAM for Hewlett Packard computers?
Oh yeah.
So how did that?
I get some credit for that because I was doing ray tracing. I was writing on using a Hewlett Packard computer to write ray tracing programs to understand how sound builds up in a room. And I needed more memory, and it was expensive. Richard?
And I'll pick up the story from there, because I was a big fan of HP computers. I had actually purchased my first desktop computer in maybe '68. It was an HP 9810, and it came with, I think all I could afford at the time was 512 bytes. 512 bytes of RAM, and eventually I expanded it to a whole kilobyte. But when Eventide could afford it, we got an HP computer with I think it was 128K bytes. And I looked at this memory board and I said, "There's nothing here," and they're charging $5,000 for it, which in those days was worth almost $5,000. So I said, "Tony, you need more RAM. I can build a RAM board that's 4 times the size for go into production for less than it would cost to buy one from HP. And that turned into a marvelous business that lasted for a couple of decades. You want a business success as opposed to a creative success. That was it.
That was it.
That's pretty. So you were just selling the boards, or were you selling the modded computers?
Just the boards. We made memory boards for the 9845, for the 9826, which was quite the bonanza, and eventually for the Series 300 machines. Mm-hmm. And eventually, when everybody else started making computers and Hewlett-Packard didn't provide that wonderful pricing umbrella for us, we said, this isn't such a good business anymore, and just discontinued it with no surplus junk, no nothing, because all it is making printed circuit boards with memory chips. We, as Tony pointed out, we got lucky. And it was all because he needed more memory for his reverb experiments.
Glad I could help.
Serendipity.
So then another thing that you I guess invented is the concept. I mean, back then it was actually hardware, but the concept of the plug-in. Years before there were digital plugins.
Well, yeah. Look, I was chasing after reverb like a lot of other people, but I also appreciated that a box that could do a quality artificial digital reverb could also do a lot more. So, from the get-go, I was designing a general purpose signal processor. I wanted to play with vocoding, digital filters to break it into bands and to delay the bands differentially. I did something called time scramble, which was like the equivalent of cutting, tape up and scrambling the time segments around. And so each of those effects required some development time, and we wanted to ship the box as soon as we had a good reverb. So we wanted it to live on and be able to offer new effects for it. So we built into the hardware something called zero insertion force, or ZIF sockets. So it'd be easy to drop in a new read-only memory, or ROM, and ship just these chips. And so we had to call it something, and plugging a chip into a socket just seemed like the natural thing to call it. So we called it a plug-in.
Wow. And look what that became.
Not my fault.
So I guess the next major feat would be the H3000. How did that? There's no flashback for that, so I'm sort of.
Well, there's no flashback. There's not yet, and there's no flashback for the 2016 yet either. Yeah, once again, we got lucky. We hired two really talented young people, Ken Bogdanovich and Bob Belcher, and put them and they ran with it. What happened? The transition from the 2016 to the H3000 is again another advance in technology. The 2016 was designed before there were special purpose microprocessors for audio processing, before there were DSP chips. Mm-hmm. So the 2016 was actually an array processor using many components to, in effect, do what a DSP chip did. Then Texas Instruments in the early 80s came out with a chip called the 32010, which was a 16-bit microprocessor specifically designed for real-time audio processing, a type of architecture called a Harvard architecture. And so it was clear that was, again, the next step. And it was, what Eventide does. Technology came along, and use it. Do the next obvious thing. And those guys did a great job. And Dave Durr came on board to do the analog design. Ken was basically the project lead for that.
Well, so as the H3000, it seemed like it sort of did many of the things that the other gear did. Were you starting to phase out the older products at that point, or when did they all sort of start to get phased out?
when you couldn't get parts for them.
Yeah, I think they kind of phased themselves out because, you know, we weren't so commercially naive that if people wanted to give us big bucks for something, we wouldn't sell it to them.
Mhm.
But at some point, it would just reach the point where, you know, we wouldn't sell enough to make it worth continuing to make them. So we said, oh, we're just continuing.
Or there was a key component that we couldn't get. I mean, the omnipressor, right? We couldn't get meters.
Oh yeah,
you know,
the meters. Oh my God.
Yeah.
We couldn't get omnipressor meters. What a silly thing.
Yeah.
Well,
but each of those products had, you know, a fairly long life. I mean, you know, 10 years life is nothing to, I don't know.
well, I mean, I guess
That's an anti-histamine.
I was trying not to say that, Richard.
Oh, come on. It's an antihistamine light. Nothing to sneeze at.
No one will understand that.
That's why I explained. Nobody watching. Probably most of the people watching today are not familiar with Bullwinkle.
Wrong hat.
I'm you, Elliot.
I am familiar with Bullwinkle.
Oh, okay.
Wrong
and
hat.
Roger the Flying Squirrel.
Wrong hat.
Yeah.
So around this time, I guess there's the other part of Eventide that most people may not be aware of is the aviation end of things. So, Richard, how did it feel to start designing for a completely different industry at that point?
Pretty natural, really, because, well, it's an electronic product, and that's what we did. Do you want me to tell you how that got started?
Sure.
Basically, we moved to New Jersey. And when we were in New York, learning to fly an airplane really wasn't, New York City, that is, Manhattan. Flying an airplane really wasn't in the cards. It was just too much of a nuisance to even try. But when I moved to New Jersey, I drove past this airport every day to get to work. And I was about to say, nobody may remember that you go to work anymore. But back in the day, drove past an airport. I said, boy, wouldn't it be fun to learn to fly? So I took flying lessons, got a very small airplane. And one day I'm flying, I think, to New Hampshire to visit somebody, not New Hampshire, excuse me, Vermont. And I made some relatively minor mistake. And I realized if I had a moving map display, I wouldn't have made that mistake. I said, no, you could put together a moving map display. You got displays, you got computers. And I got a guy who was really, really familiar with commercial aviation, who worked for us for a number of years. And we hired some people who were good at graphic design and microcomputer design. And so I was a project leader, so to speak. I put the thing in my car and tried not to kill myself or anyone else while we were testing the software. And so far as I know, I know I'm successful in not killing myself. I don't think I caused any accidents. And it turned out to be a really great product. And once again, we were selling it for, I don't know, 15 years or so.
Right. I mean, I guess in that sense, you might be able to say that you actually might have saved lives versus saving records.
For sure. Absolutely, for sure. Yeah, I obviously no way of counting them or knowing which ones we saved, but there are so many occasions where disorientation or lack of situational awareness in aviation can kill you, and this thing was just amazing. Everybody has one now, of course.
So as you got, like, you know, I guess throughout the 90s there was the H3000 and the 6 and the 8 and 9 and all these sort of things that were a larger version of that. And was there any other sort of major innovation within those pieces of gear that, I mean, besides being better and faster and having more parameters and more programs? And
well, the algorithms get more advanced, right? Because you have more process. If you have more cycles, you can do more. So, I mean, we just recently introduced something called Split EQ, which I think is revolutionary.
In what sense?
Well, it's a new way to get a handle on audio. What it does is it mimics the way we perceive audio in terms of an audio signal having some tonal and transient component. And I wish there were other words we could use, but those are the words that we've landed on. And so, you can break the signal up, split it into these two parts of sound, and process them separately, and then recombine. So you can change the timbre of sound. You can fix a lot of problems. People are fixing, are improving like the sound of a kick drum, where if it's really, really boomy, you can just bring down the energy of the tonal part of that boom, but leave the thump, of the hammer hitting the skin. People are using it to improve poorly mic'd vocals,
Right.
reducing sibilance but leaving the air. It's a fundamentally new approach, and it's something you couldn't do this realistically 5-10 years ago. It just takes a lot of signal processing. We're throwing a lot of signal processing at this problem to mimic how we perceive audio. So there's that. So
then, now that we're talking about plugins, you guys sort of got into it pretty early, I guess. Well, 2006 you started doing plugins?
I don't know. Was that really early, Richard? I mean, it was Pro Tools, basically.
Actually, Tony would know or getting into it better than I do. I remember trying to get into it in the 80s and failing. We started writing plugins, but we weren't really a software company as we have now largely become, as has everyone become. And with all the wonderful hardware we were making, wouldn't it be nice to make some of these plugins? And it just turned out to be a morass. It was probably a lot harder to do it then because nothing was standardized. There probably weren't good development kits. We hired a consultant who, for whatever reason, didn't come up with anything. And so maybe the early aughts. I don't know what.
We weren't early on, but
it wouldn't have been the 80s. It would have been the 90s. But no, we were not. We were by no means pioneers in plugins.
Okay, but so how did you sort of handle the transition of bringing the classic gear into that realm? And were you successful?
I think we were. Well, yes, we were successful. The way it happened was, well, this was, I guess, Avid was still this was still DigiDesign, but DigiDesign came to us and suggested that we create plugin versions of our hardware, and so that the first plugins were Pro Tools plugins, and we just did it internally. We finally. We brought in, let's see, Jason Beck was involved in this, Dan Gillespie. I helped model the 910 and the 949. Richard helped model the Omnipressor. Richard wrote the VSig files for the Omnipressor software version that turned into the Omnipressor plugin, and it sounds pretty true to the hardware. I think all of our emulations sound pretty true. Sorry?
I was going to say, was that an enjoyable process? Because in a way, you're sort of.
It was enjoyable because I didn't have to write any of the code. So to that regard, basically it was enjoyable because one of my favorite things in life is complaining, and I got to complain that things didn't quite sound right. So I had a great time.
Okay. So I mean, did you see it at the time as like, this is, for the future, going to sort of keep these things in the hands of people that will never be able to get their hands on the actual gear, and sort of the younger engineers can now appreciate the Eventide world? No,
that Eliot, that really wasn't the thought. The thought was there's money to be made selling plugins, I guess, and that's where the world is going. It wasn't to keep these pieces of gear alive necessarily.
Okay. Well, for someone like me, it's nice to know that this stuff is still accessible in this modern world.
That's heartwarming. That's good to hear. That wasn't the thought.
As a quick aside, there are pieces of gear when we were writing these flashbacks, there are things we couldn't get. There's at least one product that we made that the only place I could find one was on online on some very dodgy store that wanted our credit card number and wouldn't answer the phone. So there's stuff we can't get. But the other thing I wanted to say is I do have to get going. Do you have any quick questions for me? Because I have an engagement.
Well, I mean, I'm sure I could ask you long questions, but I guess the other thing is the Stompbox market and how you sort of got involved in that. I don't know if that's a you question or a Tony question.
That's a Tony question.
That's
Okay.
Joe Waltz's fault.
Yeah, I'm going to excuse myself now.
Okay.
Okay, Richard. See you later.
This has been great fun, and I'll see everyone for the Q&A, of course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Richard.
Bye.
Should we continue?
So Joe
Elliot?
Walsh.
Yeah, Joe Waltz, not Joe Waltz, not the musician. Joe Waltz, Eventide employee, former Lexicon employee. It was his thought that Eventide really should get into the Stompbox market, and he was right.
So were you involved in designing them, or?
I was involved in the. I guess I was leading the design. I wasn't actually writing the code or laying out the circuit boards, but I was helping to define the product. It was a team effort.
So let me think. If there's, I mean, I'm sort of. I could ask I could name drop a bunch of artists and ask if you have any memories, or if there's any. Are there any other modern artists that you can think of that are sort of Eventide friendly, or
I'm such a fossil. The marketing folks at Eventide might know, but
okay,
it ain't me, babe.
All right. Well, any other classics from the '70s? Like, do you have any good Led Zeppelin stories?
No. Okay. Richard was the guy was out and about more than I was. I was designing. I like now I'm running the company, so
cool.
I tend to be shy.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank Richard and Tony, both of you, for doing this interview. It's been a real honor for me, and it's been a wonderful journey just going back through the history of Eventide and realizing just how much innovation and how much of the musical progression throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s you guys were the architects of, and that the work that you did has been used by probably virtually every major artist since 1971. So I know you guys, from your perspective, maybe don't see it as much just because you're in the trenches, but for me, looking out from the outside, it's pretty awe-inspiring. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Elliot, you're too kind, and thanks for doing this. Really, it was a pleasure. Take care.
All right, thank you.
Fantastic event and presentation. I have my Carl Sagan key. On. You can see the E there, even though I'm reflecting. Elliot, wonderful job. Thank you so much. And thanks for all that insightful sharing and information. We're hoping that some questions are coming in from our viewing audience. And
Richard, do you have any questions, Richard?
Yeah, Richard, perhaps you do.
I'm hoping there are, Denny. Somehow we managed to get through this whole thing. I think Tony and I did without embarrassing ourselves or the company.
I kept interrupting.
Not at all.
Yeah,
I kept interrupting you. So.
Well, but there's still a risk.
Hopefully I made it unscathed as well.
Everybody did great. You can trust me on that. Well, look, I'll start off with the one question we have received so far, though I'm sure Elliot might still have one or two in his bag of tricks to come up with. We'll see. But apparently Alex Case would like to know, do your pets have names or product numbers? And I told him that it was a little bit fishy for us to ask that, but I'm asking anyway.
I could fetch one if I could go off camera for a moment.
Of course you can. We'd love to meet Pet Factor.
I think Richard had a guppy that he called 314, but I'm not sure.
That's pretty pie. Why not? It's a golden age. The 50th anniversary of the golden age. We might as well celebrate pie. Yeah, as I said in some of my comments, I'm looking forward to digging up my old Argus T-shirt. It's somewhere in storage, and breaking it out. A good friend makes quilts out of old T-shirts, so either I'll use it for that, or I will use it as a T-shirt, just for the historic sake of it.
I hadn't really thought of that, but there is a legacy of T-shirts from Eventide because we made T-shirts from day one, pretty much.
Absolutely, and chocolate bars. I mean, we'd
Yeah,
be
but
remiss.
yeah,
We'd
the
be
chocolate
remiss
bar.
to not mention the snack food at the booths is always superior.
Puppy.
Wow, is that a baby Bernard?
This
Saint
is
Bernard?
Winston the puppy, Mark 1. He is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel with big floppy ears.
He's awesome.
He's
Love.
really cute.
Love.
So there you go, Alex. We got you your answer. Richard doesn't use that as a password, by the way. So just so you know.
Quick interrupt. I'm looking at Facebook on the other computer, and half of us are missing.
On Facebook?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Tony and Eliot are there. You and I are not.
Oh, darn.
That's odd.
Wow.
Which is fine with me. Oh, now it's all me. There you go.
Oh, everyone's here.
I'm not sure, Richard, but Angela is also monitoring, and she sees everybody, and I see it on mine as well. So I think perhaps it's a artifact of SETI is trying to eliminate our feed. But okay.
Now it's good. Now we've got the three of us, but not you, Rowie. And
okay.
Here's Winston the puppy. Oh no, I don't see. There's a time delay. There's a long time delay.
Oh yes, there is a time delay.
No, it's a long one. It's like a minute or two.
It's if only we had this much in the chips back in the 70s. Okay, well, this is definitely a classic moment in audio. I'm very glad we're capturing it. And
Richard being confused by delay. It's lovely.
If by any chance, Elliot, if you do have another question, go right ahead. So far, wait, I do have one from the ever omnipresent and awesome Mr. John Crivet. What should we expect from the audio industry in the next 10 years? Where is it going? Now, you can go as long as you want with that answer.
Richard?
Tony? We never wanted to, well, we did want to be a nonprofit organization at some point. So I don't really feel qualified to answer that. I'm not sure anyone is. You know, we hear about surround and Atmos and all the variations of that. But you also hear about cerebral implants and a lot of stuff. As a big science fiction fan, I would like to say I have no idea. Just don't know.
Well, that triggers me to ask: is it true that there's a completely Faraday lined room at the factory?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yep.
Incredible. Is that the purpose of that is beyond just the need for testing of any kind of equipment, or is it for your involvement with SETI?
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, so John, I think I got you an answer a little bit about the future of audio.
Yeah.
It could possibly be developed in that copper room.
Well, for better or for worse, it's got nothing to do with the future of audio. It has to do with regulation compliance. And, nowadays everybody wants to make sure you're not radiating, you're not susceptible to radiation. And we corporately and personally have a decent background in radio frequency stuff. But the real fun story about the Faraday cage is that we had a guy come in claiming to communicate with aliens. And needless to say, the aluminum hat, shiny side out, whatever. And we have all the sophisticated reception and spectrum analysis equipment. And so the guy volunteered to be tested. We put him in the room. And as far as we could tell, there was absolutely no communication going, because all I had to do was take out my car key, which, you press the button to unlock the car and it shows up on the analyzer. But anything he was doing, unless it was some mysterious form of non-existent radiation, wasn't there. So we pretty much concluded he was not communicating with aliens, which is a damn shame. It would be good if he were.
And
so how did this guy come in?
Well, okay, Richard, This American Life, right, Richard?
Yeah, it was. It ended up being a story on NPR. Our executive director of the SETI League, with which we're involved, actually wrote papers on this, and one of our members was, I think, the brother of the reporter. So that we got a lot of publicity for that, but not we, Eventide, we, the SETI League, which we're involved with as well.
I have another question. It's probably well past the statute of limitations, so you probably have no problem answering it, Richard.
I didn't do it. I promise not to do it again.
Where did you actually test the Argus in your Corvette, and how fast and where was it on a highway? I mean, for it to really be valid, you'd have to have it in a speedy environment with other objects going around you. No?
No, not at all. And you just put it up on the dashboard. You connect it to a Loran or to a GPS. The real issue with the Argus was the graphic depiction, not the speed. There's no issue at all making the map move along a little faster. Whether you're going 1 mile an hour or 1,000, it works equally well.
I see.
But you want to make sure. Like I found one little anomaly. When I was making a left turn on Kinnelon Road, the map would jump to someplace, a few hundred meters away. And we found one stupid little corner case where I think, something was one count beyond where it was supposed to be. I think it was double precision. And it went up to 65536 instead of 65535. And suddenly we were somewhere else. And you never would discover that stuff. Unless you had a whole team of people just looking at everything, or you did a lot of testing. So I would just do hours of testing every day because I was a commuter.
Was that vehicle, did it have normal air in the tires or nitrogen? That's an inside joke. Right. Yeah, that's an inside joke for those of you that used to read Stephen St. Croix's articles in Mix magazine.
Stephen was so much fun. It's really
he was. And I remember clearly Richard chiming in with a bit of let's say an argument to the thesis that Stephen was putting out about the value of hydrogen in the tires.
Oh, that's right. He said hydrogen, didn't he?
Yeah. I believe so.
Yeah.
Well, I want to just, again, I mentioned it earlier, point out the amazing chocolate that's always been given away for decades, even when we were at the Hilton with the AES convention. I actually remember, before I even really necessarily knew what you guys were doing, that myself and Joe Berger, one of our first goals was to make sure we were on the Eventide line at Hilton, to get into the Eventide room so we could get our Eventide cassette, or at that part, it was just a regular chocolate bar. With, I believe it said Harmonizer on it in a psychedelic font. So it was quite memorable, and it's interesting what we remember, right, over the decades.
I think they actually said Big Bite.
There you go.
At one point they did, yeah.
For me personally, my grandfather was a chocolate maker, so I could really relate to it. Of course, as a type 1 diabetic, I probably shouldn't be participating in it, but I love the dark chocolate. So anyway, enough about me. I just want to share real quick with our viewers that are members of our AES New York section that we have moved to a new page, and that we are going to start having a contest soon. We'll be giving away some cool things. And the first thing we'll be giving away is an awesome software from our friends here at Eventide. They've helped us, as they always do, in sponsorship and providing us with solutions. So we hope that everybody that's a member of our old page comes on over and joins us in our new page, because only people that are in our new page will be qualified to potentially win. The contest will be announced in the near future. We'll be very clear about the rules, and we'll make sure that the name is completely randomly selected. And we look forward to everyone joining us in here at our new page as soon as possible. Contests will be happening in the near future. And of course, remind everybody to please join AES.org headquarters if you're not already a member. We see that we all are trying to benefit our society and, of course, move the standards forward as we always have seen AES do. Eliot, thanks again. Great job on behalf of the entire New York section committee and officers, of which I am not an officer. I'm just the technical person. I'm glad to be here in support, and we really appreciate you're doing this for us, Eliot, and we look forward to some more interviews that you'll be doing with us. We really appreciate it. And Richard, Tony, thank you so much for your time. Great job sharing with us, and we look forward to seeing everybody in the real world sometime soon.
Can I add one?
Oh, please, by all means. We have no time limitation here.
When you said thanking us for helping the AES, it really is one thing that didn't come up in the interview was how instrumental the AES show in particular was in our success. Again, we were in New York, so the fall show would be in New York, and that's where we'd get to walk around, see what other people were doing. That's where other people walking around would stop by and see what we were doing and either suggest or complain. And the papers were instrumental. I attended papers. Most of the folks walking around the show floor, the convention floor, looking at gear were the audio pros. But the academics were presenting papers and attending papers, and that's where the forward-looking stuff was. So, when you ask where does audio go in the next 10 years, stop by the next AES convention and stop by the papers, and you'll get a sense of where the industry is going. So thank you, AES.
Absolutely. Many of us attended the show with a free pass from a manufacturer, which precluded you from going into the areas where the panels of papers and presentations are. But it's one of the many reasons that it's a good idea to join, because then you have access to go. Then your biggest problem will be how to see two different presentations at the same time, which can often be the case. But very amazing stuff that happens there, and highly recommended for anybody who's a newbie or who hasn't participated. You should consider doing so. And good news, it looks like October it will return to New York, and I don't know the details, but that's what I hear. And so keep an eye out for that, and also for any announcements on our page for future events coming up soon, and the contest that I mentioned, perhaps multiple contests. We'll see how it goes. So thanks, everybody. And thanks, panelists, and look forward to seeing everybody soon. Everybody hang on for a minute while I end the stream. And thanks to our viewers. See you again soon.